Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Cloudbusters. As ever, I'm joined by my co-host, Mallory Woodrow, and this week we're going to be digging into details around Agile. And I think we've got a really fantastic guest this week that can help us with that. Who have we got, Mallory?
Yes, we are so thrilled for our guest today. We are welcoming Anders Hagman, who is the Senior Manager of Cloud, FinOps, and Technology Procurement at Spotify. Anders, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, Spotify has a very famous model for Agile, a often copied model. So to begin, could you tell us a little bit about what that model looks like? Both on a technology side and also a bit on the culture side.
Thank you, Mallory and Alex. It's good to meet with you guys and have a chat about this really important topic. And it just happens to be like Hack Week at Spotify this week, actually. So I have my Hack Week shirt on here. There's a new shirt every year, but this is my old one, and it's really really important cultural event to us, and also where we actually explore and innovate quite a bit. So it feels like good timing as well to have this conversation. I can share a little bit more how they have shaped us to where we are today. I think our cornerstones of today are a little bit more around our corporate cultural values, like a lot of companies talk about. But those sort of principles in those days, they really helped us find these values and cement them. So today we talk more about sincerity, collaboration, passion, playfulness, and so forth. And I think these really tie into the agile model that Spotify is more known for. Now we talk a little bit more internally about our band manifesto, how we work in a controlled chaos. We used to talk more about chaos, so perhaps it's a slight shift there. We also have other artifacts that are quite nice to look at sometimes, like our engineering handbook. It's not read that often, but for all engineers joining, they really take it to heart. And it's about how we manage complexity, how we define ownership, how we build resilient systems. Pretty tricky stuff, really. But you really need to get them right to be at the scale where Spotify is. So that's sort of my take on this. Primarily from a technical organization because I'm a technologist, but I think it's also ingrained in the entire culture of the company. I used to work a lot with finance and HR, and I definitely see snippets of that there as well. So,
and something I love about Spotify's culture, what I've seen, what I've read, is how much it's focused on the company's goals and the company's mission, if I'm allowed to say that, about supporting music makers and helping them live off of their art. So that actually ties into one of the myths around Agile, is that it's only for engineers. But while you've worked within technology, you're giving us these examples where finance is still mission driven, right? And other departments are mission driven. What are your thoughts around Agile as a cultural phenomenon moving outside of the tech department?
I'm still learning a lot here, and I'm just reading a book called Salvation. It's called The Bunksy Story. You pegged this up nicely for me, but you didn't know I was going to bring the book. And it's about how Lean and Kanban principles saved a small hospital in Indonesia. And they didn't get any trainings. They didn't have any books or anything like that. They did have a good agile coach that actually wrote the book. Someone that I have worked with professionally has written a bunch of books. This is his latest book. And if it can save a hospital, I think in crisis mode, I think it can work anywhere. A lot of these principles actually come from other industry verticals before. And then we as ID people sort of pick them up and document them in our way. And I think that's been good, but sometimes we're bragging a little bit too much about inventing them ourselves. Because I've also seen service desks in the financial industry be so much more agile than the team I'm working with currently, even though...
Really interesting you bring that up, okay, so we actually think that we had more agile principles in use in places maybe where I was working before, or the reason I kind of think that's interesting, the context there is because I do hear a lot of folks saying, "Oh no, we're gonna copy the Spotify agile model. You guys are seen as very much thought leaders in this space, so we need to do exactly what they're doing. We just want to pick it up, stick it in our organization." I don't know. How do you feel about that? I mean, are you complimented? Do you think that's sensible? What are your thoughts?
Oh, this is a tricky one. I've heard it at dinner parties, and people say, "Oh, you work at Spotify," and we have these consultants with us now, and they're going to implement the Spotify model with us, and we're going to be called tribes and squads and so forth. And in some ways, I laugh a little bit at it. On the other hand, I'm quite. It makes me quite scared because it's a lot about people in the end, and like if it's blueprinted onto someone else somewhere else in an entire different context, I don't think it's gonna end happily in the end. When I'm happy though if they start talking a little bit about continuous learning and so forth, and like fail fast a little bit like that, and they're like they will course correct quickly. Then I'm not so sad or scared about it anymore. Then they took on some of these like generic good principles that will work in any business, to actually dare to experiment a bit and pick up the learnings and have retrospectives and things like that. If they talk about those aspects, then I was like, oh yeah, this sounds like promising, but it's both scary and sometimes a little bit at the same time.
So Anders, you mentioned kind of the engineering kind of handbook that talks a lot about kind of ownership and accountability, but you also use a term called kind of controlled chaos, which I don't think is necessarily immediately familiar to everybody. Could you just explain a little bit more of what that means?
I think in many ways it's about allowing yourself to fail and learn from those failures. That you don't really need to be perfectly in control all the time. We have that, especially if we have a little bit of a good girl syndrome built into yourself, like I do. Then you're afraid to fail, and you feel you have this imposter syndrome. There's a lot of studies in behavioral psychology around this, and by stating up front on in our manifesto as a company that chaos is allowed, and we did this back in these old videos as well, but it makes me feel more safe to fail. And one manager actually told me, "Hey Anders, you need to fail more. You're not failing often enough." And I thought I had a pretty good hit rate, but he thought the hit rate was probably too high. So, hey Anders, you need to start dropping more balls. If you can juggle more balls, you can drop more balls, you're going to move at a higher speed. So that was a hard thing to learn for me. But that ties into the controlled chaos, I think. And we're trying to create that psychological safety aspect.
I thank you so much
to that so much. I really relate to that one about being afraid to fail. Anders, you mentioned earlier that the scaling of this type of model creates its own challenges. Can we unpack that a little more? What sort of challenges do you see with it?
Complexity grows as the company grows. I think it's also a question of communication and ownership and so forth, that the patterns around those things change, and that's where our engineering handbook picks up when it comes to the engineering part of the business in a way. If we follow these sort of healthy principles, then our systems will be resilient, and as per Conway's law, the organization sort of is reflected in its system, and vice versa. And we're a microservice oriented organization in many ways, where teams should operate and own a small piece of the business, and that piece should still be supporting an overall resilient system that we as end users sort of come to know that the beats are never dropped. So I think there's a lot of granularity in that, a lot of devil in the details, but those principles, and we spend time inventing new principles as well, not always getting them right. I can tell you something, we've just come up with something in the cloud FinOps space around how do we make decisions relating to cost for principles that are, and these principles tie in or are supporting other principles in. So you can call this a bit of a management system, or a system of beliefs, I think. I agree, but it's always moving all the time. And this is where we start breaking things as well. Not we can break things technology-wise, and we have incidents that we get to fix, but sometimes we break things in our beliefs or as well, or principles as well, and we realize after a while, hey, these things are actually contradicting with each other, or they're not really playing well, so we have to go back and update that kind of map. But it's a healthy discussion.
So Anders, you mentioned you actually just brought in some additional kind of cost-focused principles. Was there, when you were doing that, was there a particular a problem you'd observed that brought these into kind of play, or a particular objective? or what was kind of the trigger around doing that?
It was actually initiated from the engineering organization, and I think it's a little bit to work with the complexity that you end up as an engineering manager or director, that you have a lot of requirements or ask from you coming at you from different perspectives. And of course, one ask that is quite common to all of us working is that, like, hey, there's something coming from finance. Hey, you need to optimize for cost or for revenue or something financial. And how do you put that into context with all the other sort of needs in your business, which are non-financial? It's about resilience, it's about reliability, it's about perhaps team health or org health, and all of these things sort of meet in the middle of a manager's head here. So by having some of those principles expressed and perhaps as a common language with other managers, it makes it a little bit easier to navigate in this and to make that decision at a higher speed.
Well, let's talk more about the other benefits of this model. Of course, the common language facilitates communication, but let's talk about how else this model, this culture and approach can all benefit the business.
It's hard to tell with Spotify, really, because it's so ingrained from the start in the business.
Sure.
In many other ways, and we made a comparison with other businesses earlier on, it's bolted on, and you have a little bit of like a guerrilla movement around Agile, while in the case of Spotify, it's actually really held really close to and brought into a lot of communication also by C-level people, or particularly engineering directors that are really masters at these principles and make sure they are ingrained in their parts. So when it comes to benefits, I mean, there wouldn't be any Spotify without these principles, and it's such a natural part of our DNA that it's hard to list them. But I guess it comes down to, like, in my corner of the business, something relating to speed. I think developer speed or productivity. How quickly can we move? How quickly can we evolve our products? And that's something that we measure and we're quite successful at. Another thing is actually developer happiness. Like, how happy are you working at Spotify?
Really?
Because there's a lot of frustration in the developer business or community when you're working. You're being hit by so many requirements from so many different angles, and you feel like you're not moving. So I think a lot of developers share that frustration. Another like symbol or like more product evident is something we call Backstage, Backstage.io, which is something that we released in the open source, which is like a platform. Or a platform of platforms, and you can see that platform actually follows these principles, and it's a bit opinionated, we like to call it, to actually express these principles. So it helps you to follow these principles along if you work on that platform.
That's really interesting, Anders. Actually, I'm thinking now, you touched on some really interesting KPIs there around kind of developer velocity, developer happiness as well. One that I think we hear expressed a lot in the FinOps community actually is a really important metric. What are the KPIs you use to judge whether that's been successful or not if we're building a new feature or a new service? I mean, you touched a little bit on, it's like, okay, the operating cost and the delivery velocity, but are those the things you look at, or is there something bigger out there that you tend to measure kind of that performance by?
I think I got a little bit carried away there and actually missed answering Mallory's question on financial KPIs. And I think I mean, we try to look at the normal one. It's like revenue. Does something bring in more revenue? Does it bring in growth, more users? Does it make the users more engaged? Those are the three common ones. So, and then the cost is kind of raw, but we try to work a lot with unit economics to a really high degree. Like, what's the cost per something? Cost per monthly active user is the classic one for us, but there's many like varieties to this as well for different parts of the business. To always compare a cost with something, never look at the raw cost, because that feels a bit scary, and it doesn't. It's so easy to add a little bit, like one more metric to compare it with, and then suddenly you have a context.
That's something I've heard you say so many times. Anytime somebody gives you a number, ask for another number. And of course, I've taken that as life advice too. Whenever someone gives me a number, I just start asking, like, what does that mean? What's the context there? But it really speaks to unit economics and focusing on a metric the business cares about, right? A cost number is only useful if you can textualize it back into the business. And I've always really appreciated that perspective from you and from Spotify as an organization. Well, Anders, thank you for the information about how Spotify operates, what works and what is challenging. What advice would you give to other organizations trying to become more agile or going through an agile transformation?
I think you need to want to do it. And for a while, I was a bit hesitant about this as well. And I'm a bit of a slow thinker. And personal stories that I was actually a bit resistant to this in another company pre-Spotify, to like the agile guerrilla warfare sort of, because I was working mainly based on service management principles. So I was one of those people sort of blocking that initiative in that company. And probably should have listened a bit more, have bigger ears. I think that's one advice. Really listen to these people. They were pretty correct in that time, but I didn't really take their advice at heart. Another thing is to actually start at the top. This one is almost a given to a lot of people, but that was not the case in that other company. And I've heard so many stories about agile sort of ambassadors liking their way of doing guerrilla warfare, working bottom up and changing it, and that's one way of doing it. And I think you shouldn't stop doing that, but you should also start at the top a little bit to see how can you sort of really create the strategy around this, like the will as a company, like with the top leaders in the company to sort of role model that kind of behavior. And one way to do that is to actually have agile coaches and say, like, hey, we have a leadership team here, and we're the leader of function XYZ, and we manage a few hundred people here, but we actually have a leadership or agile coach that coaches us with agile principle in this leadership team. And that's one way to sort of expose that. I'm not an agile coach myself, but I've seen that work in practice in numerous occasions. So, but think about your own role in this. Do you really want to do this yourself? Eventually, I came to the conclusion I really wanted to learn this way, learn how to work in a faster, more agile way, and then I then was kind of easy to start like sucking up all the good advice in this community.
Anders, can I ask, because we do when we're doing, when folks are going through things like their FinOps practitioner certification, we do like an exercise around hopes and fears around, what would we like to get and what are the concerns that are blocking us. I think interestingly, in your story there, you touched on actually when you were at a previous organization that the whole agile concept looked kind of scary, and you had some hesitation and resistance to doing it. Could you kind of share with the community kind of what was the fear that you were hanging on to there that made you kind of reticent or concerned about doing this? I think it might be helpful for folks to hear.
Yeah, I think it ties into the controlled chaos thing there. I was like leaning so much more towards control, and I was incentivized to put controls in place and to know my numbers down to the dime, rather than move at speed and create value at a higher rate. And it's about what's being incentivized, I think, to a high degree. And that organization, I was definitely like, or at least I felt stuck on that. So eventually I wanted to do like big jumps. I jumped into Spotify and I really got to experience that chaos. And then we have shifted somewhere in the middle where we can like navigate a bit. So I think that's my personal experience from this, but everyone has a different story in it, and depends a lot on where you're coming from. I would say if you have like some really thick, efficient glasses and these glasses have made you really successful in the past, it's really hard to unlearn and take off those glasses and put them aside. And I was definitely in such a position at that time. So anyways, it's painful once you take them off. Like suddenly you don't see anything. Everything is a bit blurry. So
as an operational success metric, actually we should be failing a certain percentage of the time because it means we're trying new things.
Yeah.
I have a personal take on that one as well. I used to be like an alpine skier competing and running gates, like red gate, blue gate, red gate, so until you get down as fast as possible. And I would compete entire seasons without missing a gate. And I wouldn't end up on the podium often enough probably either. So when I started taking more chances, I would go a little bit faster, and I would crash 1 out of 3, 1 out of 4 races, miss a few gates, never made it to the finish line. I started making the podiums more often. So I think that one is a good metaphor for this. Like, if you're not crashing, if you're not missing any gates, like, then you're not moving fast enough.
To catch us when we fail, so that it's not overly destructive or damaging, but allowing us to go, you know, to push the edges in a way that isn't going to hurt our product managers, our engineers who are trying that. I think that's a really interesting analogy. I really do.
And that's going to look different for every industry, right? Like a bank, their failure line is much more conservative than a startup's failure line, which might be much riskier. But again, think about what your business needs. You can always go up to your line of risk tolerance, right? Even if that is a very conservative amount. And that still will give you more speed than you had before and more opportunities to try new things.
I worked 2 years with Spotify Finance as sort of the system owner or product area lead for ERP and the financial transaction systems. And of course, we felt that tension that you're talking about there, Mallory, quite a bit in that relationship, where the engineers, they wanted to try a lot of new technologies and so forth, and the finance were like, no, don't try anything new. Like, all we want to do is like avoid material weaknesses here. We're working to become a listed company here. Like, take no risks. And but if we didn't take any risk, maybe we wouldn't have made it all the way to be a public company or mitigated those material weaknesses. You need to take a little bit of risk too when you do business development as well. But there was definitely friction there, healthy in many ways, but friction.
Sure.
And it sparked a lot of good ideas. I think a lot of those sort of constraints or things, like in that friction, you see some sparks flying, and there's like, oh, that's actually the spark that we can all hold on to and believe in.
Thank you, Anders. I appreciate it. I think we've thoroughly dispelled the myth that Agile is just something for engineers and just something that engineers use. And I really appreciate you sharing the benefits of how Agile can be applied to the whole organization and how you kind of start to build up that process. It's not a simple kind of switch the light on and you're magically doing it. It's helpful to hear for the community, like how that takes time and how you've evolved that and honed that at Spotify. I think it's super helpful. Absolutely. Now, Mallory, my big question is, because you've had a pretty good hit rate so far in these, did you manage to find an Agile hat of the week for this? Because I'm racking my brains on what this would look like.
No. This one, once you think about it, this one makes a lot of sense. And I do have to thank my colleague Faye Weeks for the inspiration on the hat, the hatspo, if you will. She reminded me of the importance of an Agile coach, somebody with a lot of experience who's working with the different teams in the organization, helping them to scale and adopt the Agile model. So this is not too many jumps, right? We went from Agile coach to coaching to sports coaching. So what would a sports coach wear? A baseball cap.
Oh.
Nice.
Excellent. Your coaching hat is very good.
Thank you.
Who is the team that we're now?
This is the Baltimore Orioles, which is a baseball team. Baseball hat. I appreciate we're showing this in a European audience. So you may not be familiar.
No, thank you for clarifying. That was a logo I did not know, so it's that's all good. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you very much, Anders and Mallory.
Thank you.
We hope you've all enjoyed this week's edition of Cloudbusters. If you have any kind of thoughts, kind of questions, or any myths or topics you'd like us to look into, please reach out on LinkedIn at Cloudbusters or contact cloudbusters@aptio.com. And we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thank you very much, Anders. We appreciate it. Cheers. Thank you, Mallory.